I would like to welcome you to this evening's event, where we are hosting a talk by Dr. Richard Haass through a virtual link. We're doing more of these days. Please submit any questions you have during the event to Lauren Zajic, who is the administrator of this, and she is speaking to us through Zoom, or she's going to talk to you through Zoom chat. Dr. Haass is a veteran diplomat, a prominent voice on American foreign policy, and established leader of nonprofit institutions. He is in his 18th year as president of the Council on Foreign Relations, an independent, nonpartisan membership organization, think tank, publisher, and I might add, I think it's fair to say it's the most prominent foreign policy institution in the United States, outside of the government itself. In 1913, he served as the chair of the multi-party negotiations in Northern Ireland and provided the foundation for the 2014 agreement in Northern Ireland. From January 2001 to June 2003, Dr. Haass was director of policy planning for the State Department, where he directed policy staff and was a principal advisor to Secretary of State Colin Powell. Confirmed by the U.S. Senate to hold the rank of ambassador, Dr. Haass served as U.S. coordinator for policy during the future of Afghanistan and U.S. envoy to the Northern Ireland peace process. Dr. Haass has considerable additional government experience. From 1989 to 1993, he was special assistant to President George W. Bush and senior director for Near East and South Asian affairs at the staff of the National Security Council. I might add that on November 11th, our book is coming out that is edited by Andy Card and myself, of 17 essays on the Bush 41 foreign policy and the Bush 41 presidency. And Dr. Haass has written, I think, a superb essay putting President Bush in historical perspective. Dr. Haass was awarded the Presidential Citizens Medal for his contributions to the development and articulation of U.S. policy during Operation Desert Shield and Desert Storm. He previously served in the Department of State and Defense and was legislative aide in the U.S. Senate. He is a Rhodes Scholar, holds a bachelor's degree from Oberlin College, and a master's and doctor of philosophy degrees from Oxford University. He has received numerous honorary degrees and was a faculty member at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard and at Hamilton College. He is the author of an editor of 14 books on American foreign policy and management. His latest book, The World, A Brief Introduction by Penguin Press, is the focus of this evening's talk. And I might add that in any of the list of candidates for potential Secretary of State in Republican administrations, in fact, in some Democratic administrations as well, his name is always on that list, and there's good reason for that in my view. And we're going to find that out in his broad knowledge of the world in this book. Summarizing in 300 pages a subject like that is not not an easy thing to do. It's very difficult, and I think he's done a remarkable job. Let me raise a few questions before, first going to have Richard speak for 5 or 10 minutes, and then I'll ask him a few of my questions, and then we'll go to the questions we've already received from the people who've signed up for this evening's talk. Richard, could you start with your opening remarks?
Sure, Andrew. Let me say I get a lot of invitations, not because I'm anything special, but in no small part because of my position. And I turned down quite a few because I simply can't do them all. But this one was impossible for 3 reasons. One was the gentleman who just introduced me, who's a former colleague and a friend. Secondly, anything associated with 41, for me, I can't say no to. I worked for 4 presidents. I worked for President Carter, 41, 43, George W. Bush, and also for Ronald Reagan. But my 4 years at the White House working for the 41st president were as good as it gets, which brings me to the third reason I couldn't say no. the reason it was as good as it gets was some of the people I work with, including Bob Gates, including 41, Jim Baker, but also, and last but anything but least, Brent Scowcroft. And as you all know, we lost Brent not long ago. I was honored to give one of the eulogies at his funeral at Fort Myer in Washington, just outside of Washington. And I compared Brent to the opposite of a sabra. In Israel, sabras are native-born Israelis. And the sabra fruit is very rough and spiky on the outside, but sweet on the inside. Or soft on the inside. I said, Brent is actually just the opposite. Brent was mild-mannered on the outside, very easygoing, but his intellect was anything but mild. It was fierce, really tough-minded and really principled. And he was the best mentor I ever had and one of my closest friends. So for me, it's a real personal honor to again have this chance to interact with anything that's associated with him. So thank you for giving me that, giving me this opportunity. Look, it's very hard to talk about a book called The World, A Brief Introduction, something as immodestly titled as that. My basic argument in the book, and in some ways you all don't need it because you're where you are. And by that I mean, I want to make the case that the world matters. And obviously we're seeing that day in, day out with COVID-19, a pandemic. What began in Wuhan didn't stay there. We just marked the 19th anniversary of 9/11. Terrorist trains in Afghanistan killed 3,000 people here in a day. Climate change is the manifestations of it around the country are large and growing. Cyberspace, we're about in less than a month, we're going to have an election, and this election will not be free from foreign interference in no small part because of the digital domain and its ability to be abused by outsiders. So I want Americans to be aware of the world. I want them to basically understand that isolationism is folly. We can hide our head in the sands, but we will literally be washed away by the rising tide. So denial is not a strategy, nor is isolationism. I also implicitly in the book is an argument for multilateralism, that there's nothing we can do better alone than we can do with others. Now, what we do and how we do it, that's the stuff of policy. But my basic argument is that, again, we need to work with others. And one of the great things about American foreign policy is we get up in the morning and we lace on our shoes and we have several dozen partners and allies willing and able to work with us in Europe and Asia and elsewhere. And that is in many ways the great structural advantage of American foreign policy. I wrote the book because I want people to understand that on the whole, remarkable results of the last 75 years, which coincides with the American period of the era of American leadership in the world coming out of World War II, is not the natural or normal way of things. That it was and remains a remarkable accomplishment, the absence of great power war, the fact the Cold War stayed cold and then ended on terms that were extraordinarily favorable to us, the fact that the average person in the world lives several decades longer than he or she would have lived 75 years ago. The average American lives about 10 years longer. Wealth in the United States and around the world has gone up exponentially. Far more people in the world live democratically, live under self-rule. This has been a remarkable run of history, better than anything that came before. And part of the reason I wanted to write this book is I wanted people to appreciate that and realize again that it just didn't happen, and it just doesn't remain automatically. Almost like high school science, the natural way of things is not order. Instead, it's entropy, it's centrifugal forces. And so part of the lesson I wanted readers to take away by reading the history and looking at various challenges around the world is to understand that we've benefited from our international activity. It doesn't mean we didn't get it wrong at times. Of course we did, in Vietnam and Iraq and so forth. But more often than not, we've actually gotten it right. And rather than even though, put it this way, even though it has been obviously costly in terms of lives and also in terms of treasure, speaking about the money side, what's so interesting to me There's two things: that while we were doing a lot of what we were doing in the world, we were improving so much domestically that we were able to do everything we needed to do in the world and still thrive here at home. And even now, as much as we spend on defense and the rest, it's actually only a fraction of what we spent or what we averaged during the Cold War, which is and I think it's an important lesson now, because whoever wins this election, whoever sits in the Oval Office come January, is going to inherit a country of enormous domestic needs because of COVID, because of unemployment, because of race, because of politics, because of infrastructure, because of education, because of immigration, you name it. And the temptation is going to be to turn inward. And yes, we've got to address all those things. Indeed, I once wrote a book called Foreign Policy Begins at Home, but foreign policy can't end at home. And we've got to stay involved in the world because, again, what happens out there will affect us. And the world's not going to give us a pause or a timeout. The world doesn't go to the United States and say, hey, you Americans, sort yourselves out, get your act together, and come back in a couple of years, and we'll be waiting for you. It doesn't work that way. So what we're going to have to figure out over the next 4 years and beyond is how to do what we need to do at home and do what we need to do abroad, not as an act of philanthropy, not that I'm against philanthropy, but as an act of enlightened self-interest. And so what I want people to come away with is understanding that national security is a coin that has two sides, an external international side and an internal domestic side. And we get in trouble if we ignore either side of that coin. So let me just set it up that way, Andrew. I could go on, but I will show uncharacteristic discipline and self-restraint. And I will make ourselves vulnerable to your questions and those of all the others on this in this meeting.
I do want to thank you for doing this, because I do know you had an awful lot of it. And I also want to thank you for writing the chapter in our book, because you're in the middle of, you just finished one book, you're writing another book, and you put weeks aside to write that chapter. And thank you for doing it. Thank you.
Well, again, anything associated with 41, it's just about impossible for me to say. Now, let's say 30 other seconds to the students here and others, which is, people talk about the deep state. There's a lot of criticism of government and the rest. I really reject that, and I'm really offended by that. And I think public service is really important. It's one way of giving back, but also even self-interested. It can be as satisfying and as interesting as anything you will ever do in your life. So whether you plan on it for a career or not is almost immaterial. I just hope at some point you'll give yourself a run at it for a year, 2 years, whatever, a couple of years. So if you do it when you're young enough, you may decide it's what you want to do forever. You may decide, no, you want to go become a lawyer, a doctor, an engineer, what have you. Great, but you'll be better at whatever it is you choose to do if you've had this experience. So here you are in a public policy school environment. And I really hope, whether it's at the state or local or federal level, in this country or abroad, that you get that experience. My life has been fundamentally changed, and overwhelmingly for the better, by the opportunity I had.
Just a little advertisement here, Richard. We have one of the highest percentages of any school of public policy, particularly international affairs, of students who actually go into public service. There are schools, I will not mention them because you and I have been associated with a couple of them, where students go to schools that are called schools of government, where virtually everyone goes to Wall Street or makes a lot of money. They do not spend their time in public service. And I think that's sad, frankly. I'm a capitalist, so I believe in the private sector, and that drives our economy, and we need it. But I think diminishing public service or looking down on it is a dangerous trend, because it means the best people don't go into public sector work, both as career officers, but also as political appointees. So I thank you for saying that. Thank you for saying that.
That's the virtue of being true.
Yes, yes. So let me ask you a few questions to begin with. One,
yes, sir.
You've covered an extraordinary number of issues in the book. One you did not talk about, which I actually think will, over the next 20 or 30 years, become more critical, and that is the world, I call it the world food system. I guess other people are now viewing that term, not because of me, but they're reaching the same conclusion. Most of it is private sector, as it should be. but it relies on open oceans. A huge portion of what people eat travels on the ocean. 60% of the calories that people consume at one point are on the open seas. And we protect the trade routes of the world through the US Navy, as the British did in the 19th century with their Navy. But absent the United States, the world food system actually might not function very well. So that's one issue I would like to ask you about that you have not covered. And that's not a criticism of the book because it's impossible to cover all these issues. But one of the other issues I was going to raise, except you already raised it in the book, even though this went to press before COVID-19, is you did talk about and predicted a pandemic. You didn't know what the nature of it would be, but you talk about that in the book. So first, food security, and then COVID-19.
Yeah, well, food security is a real issue. I only dealt with it glancingly, you're right, criticism accepted. In part, I'm worried about demographic pressures, particularly in Africa. I mean, when you look at the next 30, 40 years, the demographic challenge of much the age of population shrinkage and the ratio of working age to non-working age will skew in the wrong direction. Even South Asia is likely to level off in 20, 30, 40 years. Africa is the place that's not leveling off. You're going to have a population bulge, at least an extra billion, maybe 1.5 billion more people over the next half century. And one real question is social services, from schooling to jobs and the rest, but obviously food and water are going to be a real issue. And what's going to exacerbate it or add to the challenge is going to be climate change. And we're beginning to see water shortages. We're beginning to see the shrinkage of arable land. And what worries me is beyond the humanitarian aspect, it will cause refugee flows in Africa, as you know from the history of it. That can also cause conflict. So I do think it's a real issue. I see it as a subset of the importance of keeping free movement, free transit at sea, whether it's agricultural goods or manufactured goods or anything else. And there are challenges to it, but for the most part, I think there's enough distributed self-interest in it that it is largely gone unchallenged. And, I think there's also interesting questions, and I would defer to you, Andrew, about technology. There are also genetics and the rest, about the possibility of, through technology, increasing food supply and making it more insect resistant, contending with the effects of climate change and the rest. So, again, it's a real issue, and so I'm glad you raised it. The pandemic, yeah, look, I did write about it in the chapter on global health. There's historical, all sorts of examples besides the flu 100 years ago, more recently Ebola, HIV/AIDS, MERS, SARS, and so forth. So to me, it was a question of when and not if. It wasn't just me, it was Bill Gates and others, a lot of people who work in this space. And I think this is part and parcel of living in a modern world. This is a manifestation of globalization. These things are going to happen, and we have to assume they're to one degree or another, they're going to spread. That is, if not inevitable, highly likely. And one could be critical of China, and one should be critical of China and the World Health Organization for what they did and did not do in the initial month or 6 weeks of the outbreak. But that said, what happened happened. It spread beyond Wuhan to China, beyond China to the world. And we and others have to be prepared. And one of the lessons of this is whether you're dealing with terrorists or infectious disease, you've got to have mechanisms to attack it, to protect yourself against it, to build resilience into your society. And so one of the takeaways from this is we've got to derive all sorts of lessons from this pandemic. We've got to strengthen global health machinery. And this is not just past tense. We've got the challenge of developing, producing, manufacturing, and distributing therapeutics and vaccines. And I would simply say that we're not anywhere near where we need to be in that process, in part because the United States and China are not actively cooperating with it. So I think there's lots of challenges. Just as a plug for the Council on Foreign Relations for a second, tomorrow We have the publication of a new report by a task force headed by a former Secretary of Health and Human Services and a former head of Homeland Security on preparing for the next pandemic. All the lessons derived from the United States and the world and what we've done and haven't done and what needs to be put into place so we are much less vulnerable to the likelihood that, you know, one day there'll be a COVID-26 or COVID-23, or there'll be some bacteria come along that are antibiotic resistant. We can't assume in any way this is a one-off. To the contrary, we should assume that this is a precedent, and we ought to be prepared for it. Just 30 more seconds, Andrew. I'm sorry. What's so interesting, and I learned a lot about it writing the book, is that it's as significant as COVID is, and pandemics, and as horrific as they are, there's been this slow motion crisis in the world of non-infectious disease, what's called NCDs, non-communicable diseases. And that's things associated with lifestyle, with alcoholism, drug abuse, diabetes, sedentary lifestyles, cancers, and so forth. And at least until the pandemic came along, 6 of the 7, if my numbers are right, of the largest, of the health challenges that were leading to loss of life in the world and to massive spending were non-infectious diseases. So going forward, the lesson I take, we've got to deal for the inevitability of the next infectious disease, the next pandemic, and we've got to continue to deal a lot better with the reality of these non-infectious diseases, which are, first of all, taking people out of the workforce much earlier than would normally be the case around the world. And then the resulting healthcare costs to take care of them are that much higher. So it's a double hit. And there's a real epidemic of that going on as well.
There are 4 trends that I started seeing 2016. You mentioned them. I know President Bush 43 speaks about this, not as much publicly, but I know privately he does. 3 of them are isolationism, nativism, anti-immigrant feeling, and protectionism, but I would add ultranationalism. Those 4 trends we saw, sadly, in the 1930s. And some historians would certainly argue that it was one of the factors that led to World War II and the rise of Hitler and the Imperial Japan. And we're seeing those trends now. Now, I'm not suggesting this is a repeat of history, but is it a little troubling to you? You mentioned some of these trends right now. Are we headed for a world war, Richard? Or is that
well, like the answer is, you know, there's nothing inevitable about the future of history. But, you know, in Mark Twain's old saw, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. Look, there's enough things going on. I don't know where we're heading. And the good news, again, is nothing's baked into the cake. Nothing's inevitable, but people ought to be worried. They ought to be worried by the revival of geopolitics from Russia, from China, great power rivalry. They ought to, the chance for major power conflict is greater today than it was 5 or 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. No one's going to write a book today called The End of History. More likely is a title called The Return of History. People ought to be worried about these global challenges, the kind of thing we're living with now. People ought to be worried about the revival, among other things, of isolationism, protectionism, lots of isms out there. Or another way, you know, I mentioned the last 75 years were a great run in the world. Well, what's so interesting about it, it reflects a run of American foreign policy. But this is the minority. If you look at the, 225, 250 years of existence of this republic, the last 75 years are the exception. A much longer period, a much higher percentage of American history has been characterized by the United States being essentially isolationist, not being involved in affairs beyond its its borders. And so we ought to take this seriously. This possibility, again, I think would be seriously misguided. But the reason I wrote this book is one of the useful things I've learned in the last 3 or 4 years is not to assume anything. And things we thought were givens, guess what? They're not givens. And so one of the lessons I take is that people like me who are, I don't know what I am, members of the foreign policy establishment, I think we got too comfortable with the debate. Or another way of putting it, every American president from Truman through Obama essentially shared most of the fundamentals of American foreign policy. The debates are at the edges. Donald Trump has come in and he does not share the fundamentals. You may think that's great, you may think that's awful. I'm not a big fan of it myself, of his position. But my point is simply, I think he is reflecting something larger in our society, that a big chunk of Americans don't essentially accept or understand the case for American involvement in the world. So I think the reality of isolation is here. And I think the potential for more of it is here. Same thing with protectionism, nationalism, nativism, and so forth. I think that's what we're learning. So to me, this means that people who feel otherwise, as I do, we've got to go out and make the argument, whether it's for high schoolers or college people or in the public marketplace. I don't think we have the luxury of assumptions anymore.
Let me move to the questions that have already been submitted by our participants. The first is that social media has distorted a proper sense of reality about the world that is almost impossible to manage or understand. I think part of the response to the pandemic was created by the social media. There's a debate as to what the federal government should or should not have done, whether they should have closed the economy. I think the economy would have closed down whether the national government ordered it to or not, or whether the states did, because people read it on the social media and get scared. This whole movement against masks. I mean, we have a project in the Scowcroft Institute on pandemics for the last 5 years. We've been issuing white papers on this as to what should be done. Actually, President Trump signed an executive order on this 2 years ago and actually took language out of one of our papers verbatim and put it in the executive order. Our researchers and our senior people in the Institute were saying they didn't footnote this. I said, executive orders don't have footnotes. It's flattering that they took language out. They didn't implement the things they signed, but at least they signed it. But I think, you know, this anti-mask movement, part of it's being stimulated by the internet. Another thing that we are going to rely on is people accepting the vaccine when it comes out. And a substantial portion of the American people are saying they're not going to get vaccinated because they don't trust vaccines. And this is, by the way, from not just the populist right, it's the progressive left as well. There are more similarities. This would be, I'm sure, upset them for me to say this. There are more similarities between the progressive left and the populist right. If you take out who they loathe and who they love, take that out of the equation. They're both protectionist. There is an isolationist element in both the far left and the far right in the United States. The anti-vaccine movement in the United States is both on both sides of the spectrum, unfortunately. How do we deal with the social media? And it's certainly it's benefited us in some ways, but it's had some very bad side effects.
Yeah, and I take it as something of a reality. And yes, there could be better policing of social media by the companies, though the idea that the people who work there are going to be our vetters makes me a little bit uneasy. I'm probably a minority here. I do not like the idea of anonymity on social media. I think that's unfortunate. I think it allows much more outrageous stuff to be produced and circulate. I realize I'm probably a minority there. Look, I think you've got to compete, because there's also wonderful stuff on the internet. But you've got to compete beyond the internet, and a couple things come to mind. Look, one of the reasons the anti-mask movement is powerful is you have senior people, beginning with the president, who are essentially anti-mask. And if you had a president who was basically said, wore masks, modeled it essentially, and said, this is required on all federal property, and encouraged others to do it. And people saw that in those states where it was required, where governors ruled, those states had lower rates of infection, might catch on a bit. Or, you know, people are going to be suspicious of vaccines, I understand, on right and left. On the other hand, if we get into the business of rushing a vaccine, we're going to increase the odds of suspicion, and God forbid we have something like we had with swine flu, where certain vaccines, swine flu turned out to be unnecessary, but where some people got sick, or I think a couple even died from the vaccine. If you have even one horror story, I think there'll be a lot of pushback. And the other area I think we've got to deal with what I guess was quote unquote alternative facts, or whatever you want to call it, or unhelpful themes, is in education. I get on my hobby horse and I talk about high schools and colleges, and I think that we ought to do a better job of teaching civics. We ought to require it. I think there ought to be national standards. We only have one constitution. I think there ought to be a national standard in civics. I think colleges ought to say, before you leave this campus with a piece of parchment in your hand, you are literate about the world you're going to enter, and you are knowledgeable about the country you grew up in here. So I think public and private education needs to do infinitely better at dealing with these issues. But so there's always going to be bad stuff out there. What worries me now is the balance, if you will, between the serious, accurate stuff and the conspiracy stuff. And I just think we need to strengthen the hands of those who are putting out serious, accurate information.
You make a very strong case for free trade, open trade, the global trading system, which actually started a long time, 75 years ago, but it has successively got stronger, and it really took off when Reagan was president since 1980, and we've seen the consequences of that. There is a lot of hostility in the United States, again on the left and the right, to the open trading order for different reasons. But some people are now saying, who were supporters of free trade and understand the economic argument, that the cost may have been too high in getting lower trade barriers that impoverished Americans by the loss of jobs. Now, there's a debate about that. The great bulk of the loss of jobs are a function of automation, not a function of free trade. But that's not the perception. Did we go too far with this open trading system? Certainly, we made the argument in the Scowcroft Institute that with respect to drugs, 85% of the active pharmaceutical agreements, ingredients of our drugs, and I might add much of the rest of the world, Europe is in the same boat we are made in China, manufactured in China. And the disturbing thing is it's in Greater Wuhan where this epidemic started. And it's not that the Chinese deliberately shut down exports of these drugs. The factories were shut down because of the epidemic. And there were critical shortages for 3 or 4 months of several dozen very important drugs in the United States. These are prescribed drugs because of the factories being shut down. Is there a risk to these global supply chains politically and on a non-economic basis?
I think there's two separate arguments you've raised, so let me deal with them sequentially. One is the basic argument against free trade that we have been losers, and I would say that's simply factually wrong. Our standard of living has gone up dramatically during the era of free trade. One, per capita income has gone up dramatically. Consumer choice has gone up dramatically. The competition in many cases has helped us. Now, have there been some losers? Of course. Certain factories have closed, foreign competition in some cases displaced what it is we do. But there's two big buts. One is, in many cases, as you correctly pointed out, Andrew, the culprit was not foreign competition, but was productivity increases, innovation, and so forth. And so whether that's when that is the culprit or even when it's not, what we need to do is a much better job of helping American workers. No one can assume that they're going to have a job for life. Everyone has to assume now that in the course of a career, they might have 10, 15, 20 or more jobs. And what we've got to do is figure out the periodic refresher or training, reskilling of workers as technology and other forces kill off some jobs, but also bring other jobs into existence. We've got to provide the safety net, healthcare, transitional economic help, and so forth, so workers can transition while they reskill from one job to another. So to me, the answer is not to shut down trade. Millions of Americans do extraordinarily well who are in export-oriented industries, millions of jobs directly, and then millions more indirectly. I think there's also strategic benefits from trade and helping development, helping allies, giving potential foes reasons to think twice against acting disruptively. So I think the case for trade is powerful. I don't think we've made it very convincingly. And we do have to understand that there's people who lose either from trade or from innovation, and we've got to do much more to help them. And so I just take that as a one part of the argument. The second half, yeah, I think there was what we've learned through COVID is that it's not enough to think simply about price and efficiency when it comes to trade. And that for all sorts of items deemed to be essential, whether there's a certain technology or, as you were talking about, things that go into critical medicines, say heart medicines or cholesterol medicines or whatever that millions of Americans rely on, we've got to look at the security of supply. And what we don't want to have is a situation where we rely on a single or whatever small number of foreign suppliers. Anything could happen. It could be civil wars, could be monsoons, could be earthquakes, could be a nuclear accident, could be political pressure, could be an outbreak of an infectious disease, and it could get disrupted. So having a situation where you don't have inventories and all you care about is price is clearly inadequate. So to me, there's three potential responses. You diversify foreign supply, so you don't put all your eggs into one basket. Two, of those items deemed critical, you build domestic stockpiles, the equivalent of a strategic petroleum reserve. Or third, you mandate a degree of domestic production. And I would say with the latter, we just want to be careful because one, it could be much more expensive. And two, we need to think about if everyone around the world starts saying, supply chains are too vulnerable, we're going to start producing the following 86 or 186 or 286 items. If everybody does that in an uncoordinated way, we have a word for it. It's called protectionism. And the global trading order will break down. So if we are going to move to a world of more secure supply chains, a degree of self-sufficiency and so forth through stockpiling and the rest, we just got to do it in a coordinated manner. So I think we probably went too far in the direction of simply thinking about price and efficiency. But we have to be careful as we pull back, we do it in an orchestrated, coordinated way so it doesn't lead to a breakdown of global trade.
We just opened, I think within the last year, a center on grand strategy. And I have a question here. Does the concept of a national grand strategy, is it still valid? If so, when was the last time a US administration carried out an American grand strategy?
I think we had a grand strategy of sorts during the Cold War, authored by Mr. Kennan and others, containment. Though even a grand strategy of that sort didn't spell out exactly how to implement it or execute it. There were a lot of people who say, yeah, I agree with containment, therefore we needed to do what we did in Vietnam. And others would say, well, I agree with containment, but Vietnam was a mistake. So I think there's certain limits to grand strategy. It doesn't answer every conceivable question for you. I don't think we're necessarily going to get a consensus about what ought to be the proper ends or goals of American foreign policy or the preferable means. In a lot of cases, the means are going to depend on circumstances. But I do think it's healthy to have a debate on goals. Should it be to influence the foreign policies of others? Should it be to transform them into democracies? Should it be to alleviate humanitarian hardship? I would just say going forward, the reason the grand strategy debate gets really complicated is I think we're living in an era where we've got two very distinct sets of national security challenges. And I can't, with one exception, I can't think of a common denominator. One is dealing with the familiar stuff of great power rivalry, a difficult, to say the least, Russia, a rising and increasingly assertive China. How do we deal with that? There's that set of challenges, which is the traditional stuff of grand strategy. But then in this era, we have the entire additional overlay of global challenges: climate change, digital proliferation, terrorism, pandemics, you name it. And the question there, so traditional thinking about grand strategy doesn't really help you. Now, to me, there are certain common denominators. The only way you can deal with either the rising powers or global challenges is by working with others, partners and allies, and so forth. We can't ignore these challenges. We can't deal with them successfully alone. We've got to have degrees of multilateralism and so forth. But I'm not sure grand strategy helps you too much, because by the time you get to a level of meaningful detail, you're beyond grand strategy. So, but I would simply say, for me, what I would want is an American foreign policy that at one and the same time deals with the traditional stuff of geopolitical challenges, but also now is at least as concerned, if not more concerned, with global challenges, and thinks about fashioning coalitions to deal with either set of the geopolitical or the global challenges. And maybe that if that adds up to a grand strategy, then so be it. But I think that's where we are.
Okay. Speaking of foreign policy, we are at a critical moment now in our national elections, and we're going to have I hope we'll have a decision on election night. There's some people afraid that there won't be a decision, but we'll see. What if you could change, or if you could give advice to either president face to face, either candidate, to change one thing in American foreign policy, what would it be?
I could change only one thing. By several things, I could do that too. But if I could change only one, I would probably talk about the importance and value of allies. They're the great force multipliers of America's involvement in the world. They bring so many resources to the table. And whether it's dealing with a China or Russia, or dealing with all the global challenges I just enumerated, these partners, these allies, give us tremendous capacity and leverage. So I would say that we need to go back to an allied-centric foreign policy. And if I could change one thing, that would probably I'd probably start to repair America's partnerships and alliances.
By the way, I fully agree with you. I think that's how I would have answered it if I had been asked the question. So, and I think there are other thinkers on this subject who would agree with you. In my field of development, it's certainly true.
Sure. And again, it's the beginning of all else. I think if we have that foundation, whether it's putting pressure on China or Russia, or dealing with climate, or dealing with disease, that gives us the resources and the collective effort. And then we can have those conversations about what precisely we do. But without that, it seems to me we are kicking away the greatest structural advantage. I mean, what's so interesting is China wakes up in the morning, doesn't have any partners or allies. During the Cold War, all the allies and partners of the Soviet Union were there by coercion.
That's right.
And the Soviet Union had to use a lot of resources to keep them down. We have voluntary participants in what it is we want to accomplish regionally and globally. What a great advantage. Why are we kicking it away?
I agree with you. My experience in the developing world is when there is a problem or a crisis in the country, the first place they go, other than their own ministries, is not to the United Nations, and it's not to be critical of the UN or the World Bank. It's to the American Embassy and the US Aid mission, if they have one, to ask for advice, just advice, not just necessarily money. But I've been astonished in my years doing the work that I have done at how central American leadership is and how respected it is all over the world. Even adversaries privately would tell me, we always rely on the United States, even though publicly we criticize you, which I think is a backhanded compliment. If you were going to replace one element of the post-World War II international order, replace it or completely redesign it, what would you choose?
I'm going to give you two answers to that, because there's the original elements of the order, the UN, the IMF, what was the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the World Bank, and so forth. I would probably put the greatest emphasis on the trading side, modernizing the World Trade Organization. Because I've never put a whole lot of stock in the UN. The UN's not a structural problem, no matter how you redesign it. Where you have great power differences, the UN can't deal with it. The more technical IMF and World Bank things, those need to constantly be adapted to circumstances. So, but I'm more worried right now. I'm most worried about the World Trading Order. The last round of global trade talks died. The adjudication dimension of the global trading system is increasingly useless because we've essentially blocked it. And again, I see trade as a major form of economic growth, of development. It can be a force for peace. So if I could do one thing with the original international system, I would go there. And then now I would, what's happened is certain problems or challenges have popped up that didn't exist then or weren't on the agenda. And I would probably, they're both, one is slightly more doable. I think one is to deal with climate change. And I think one has to go way beyond Paris. Even if the United States went back into Paris, the entire Paris approach is woefully inadequate for dealing with climate change. And the other would to begin to come up with a mechanism for dealing with behavior in cyberspace. It is the least regulated domain of international relations, and we're seeing it increasingly abused and used for all sorts of dangerous purposes. So I would probably focus there, and I got a lot of things in between. I mean, the bottom line is, Andrew, every single institution or arrangement out there, from proliferation to dealing with global public health, there's major shortfalls. So we've got to either improve existing machinery or introduce new machinery. And I think, being realistic, we shouldn't think as our model, the UN General Assembly. We should not think of universalism as our image of multilateralism, but it should be much more coalitions of the willing and able and relevant governments and non-governments alike, and it ought to be task specific. So whatever the specific challenge is, we ought to think about who do we need to bring around the table to deal with this in the first instance. Hopefully over time we can get others on board. But I think we really need to have a kind of flexible, task-oriented multilateralism.
You deal with the issue in your book of, and explain it, I think, well, the US dollar is the reserve currency of the world. You point out that 60% of the reserve currency now is the dollar, 20% the euro, but that there's no other currency that can even come close. And that's the reason that no one else is going to other currencies, is because the alternatives aren't there. The Chinese would like to eliminate the dollar as the reserve currency, but that would require them floating the value of the renminbi, and they're not going to do that because then they lose control of their own economy. Have we, by these massive budget deficits, which for me, maybe my republicanism is coming out, but there was $1 trillion budget deficit before COVID-19. Then we just added $3 trillion in deficit spending. So 50% of the budget in this fiscal year is deficit spending. I mean, it's worse than World War II, or it's as bad as World War II. There are going to be consequences to this. So the question is there an alternative beyond the ones that you mentioned of the reserve currency being the dollar? Will people lose so much confidence in us that some other, I don't know what other system there would be that could take the place of it, but is there a risk because of how we've managed or not managed, particularly the current crisis, but even before that crisis, we still had $1 trillion budget deficit?
The short answer is yes, though your going in statement is exactly right. In the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king, and the dollar is the one-eyed man here. And there's no clear alternative to the dollar. Europe has had its issues. Yen is too small. China's not convertible. And I don't think we're ready to move to Bitcoin. So, but what's happened? One is the enormous debt we've run up. It's quite stunning. My own view of debt is it's fine until the day it's not. I think people are too sanguine about it. We have increasingly politicized the Federal Reserve. People have to remember that the Federal Reserve is, yes, it's the American central bank. But since the rest of the world is using the dollar in many cases, it's essentially the world's central bank. And if we politicize it, and if the independence of the Fed is no longer seen as a given, the rest of the world will lose confidence. Also, I think we're hurting the position of the dollar by our weaponization of America's economic instruments, in particular all the sanctions, and using dollar to try to cut off access to a dollar-denominated world and banking system. So I think what we've done is increased people's openness to the alternative. I think there's much more interest, and I see it academically. People are talking about it more. And at the moment, again, the dollar lives on. And by the way, people, it's a tremendous advantage for us. When we build up debt, we don't have to translate them into other currencies and worry that what we thought was the $100 worth of debt just became effectively $120 worth of debt because of currency movements. It's a tremendous advantage to be in control of the world's reserve currency. We can print more dollars when we need them and so forth. But all of this depends upon the rest of the world retaining confidence in the dollar and in our management of it. And I would just say, again, I've learned not to assume anything, so I just don't assume this is somehow a God-given fact of international life. And so my own sense is we are beginning to hasten the emergence of alternatives. It probably won't be like flicking a switch. We won't go from a dollar-centric world to something else in an afternoon. But I think we're going to see the gradual erosion of the dollar's primacy. And the degree to which it erodes and the pace at which it erodes, I think will depend in part upon how we are seen, in part what other currency or currency-like instruments evolve. But my sense is in 10 or 20 or 30 years, the dollar will play a less significant role than it does now to our detriment.
There's a lot of focus by the president on China as a threat and a strategic competitor. For me, at least, I actually think that Russia is not a competitor, they're an adversary, and I use that word carefully. That they're, we had Bob Zellick on his new book, and he referred to Russia as the spoiler. There's a study at GW, I think it was the engineering school actually, that looked at messaging on the Twitter, and they found on vaccines that this is before COVID-19, 50% of negative messaging on vaccines to make people very suspicious of them was coming from Russian bots. The Russians are involved in trying to undermine scientific and public confidence.
By the way, just to interrupt for a second, that's one of the reasons I am against anonymity on the internet. I think the prevalence of Russian bots is a truly, truly destructive force in our political and social debate.
What should we do about it? What should we do about it, you said?
I would ban anonymity. I would only have, essentially, people would have to be out there under their real names, and they'd have to be real individuals.
Huh. And there's a way to do that from a regulatory standpoint, but probably huge resistance from...
Enormous resistance.
Yeah. So, Lauren...
I'm sorry, I interrupted you. You were asking about China.
Yes. Well, I was asking about China. I don't see China as destructive. I think they are a competitor, and I think they're an adversary. I'm not an adversary, but they're a competitor, and they've done some things that are abusive that we need to deal with, but they have an interest in the international system as it is. Russia has grown more isolated. They used to import 40% of their food. Now they only are in Russia. They import 10% now because Putin said we're going to grow our own food now. They're really withdrawing in some ways from the international system. The Chinese are trying to control the international system, and we're letting them do it, which I think is a very bad thing. We've just 4 years now, you simply let them take over the United Nations system. I'm astonished that we've allowed that to happen.
I got a lot of reactions. Look, I agree. I think you're exactly right to distinguish between Russia and China. Very different kind of challenges. And Russia's not integrated, particularly in the world economy. They've got a lot of military force. They are spoilers. They're outliers. And China's different. China is integrated in the global economy. And I think they want to, I wouldn't use the word control so much as they want to shape or influence the way the world works in ways that they see more consistent to their interests, less threatening to their political and economic system. Look, I think my bottom line is with China is that we need to push back where we need to push back, and we ought to try to do it in a way that doesn't preclude cooperation in those areas where it makes sense to cooperate, say on climate or health or dealing with the North Korea, but we need to push back on the South China Sea or on Taiwan or what China's doing with India or Japan, or we ought to criticize them on Hong Kong or human rights or whatever. I think we got to get, there's an idea out there in the body politic that I think is seriously ill-advised or misguided, which is the idea that we can't have a good relationship or a good enough relationship with China until there's regime change there. The House just put out a task force report a couple of days ago. Secretary of State made a speech at the Nixon Library. I think that's truly misguided and unrealistic. I think it won't work any better than rollback worked with the Soviet Union. I think we've got to deal with the China that is, and again, we've got to push back, and the best way I know to push back is with allies and partners in Europe and in Asia. A lot of them are ready to push back with us against China. And I think we also have to be pretty hard-headed here. Xi Jinping's China is a different kind of China. This is not Deng Xiaoping's China. This is not a China that says we need a stable exterior, we need time to develop at home. This is a China much more in a hurry. This is a much more assertive China, much more repressive at home, much more assertive in the neighborhood and around the world. So I think we have to adjust American foreign policy accordingly. But again, it's a very different 21st century if the United States and China end up in a quote unquote Cold War. So my goal is not to do that. My goal is to, again, to push back where we have to, but if at all possible, to maintain the possibility of selective cooperation with China regionally and globally where it's in our interest to do so.
You know, the sad thing is that the one thing we cooperated with the Soviet Union on in an integrated fashion during the Cold War was to exterminate smallpox, to wipe it out as a disease. You know, there's been no one has had smallpox since 1977 because there was a concerted effort by the Soviet Union and the United States coordinated through the World Health Organization. And it worked. It was done during the 1960s into the 70s. And I actually proposed in an article I wrote for PRISM, which is not exactly a widely read journal, the National Defense University Journal on Strategy, on the use of foreign aid during periods of great power rivalry. I argued the one area, this was written before COVID-19, that we should work with the Chinese and the Russians is on pandemic disease and the risk of infectious disease, because all of us are at risk. And now it's become part of the geostrategic competition with both countries, and the chances of us working with them cooperatively is unfortunately diminished because of what's happened. And I don't put all the blame on us. I put a lot of the blame on China, how it tried to manipulate things early on. I mean, there's some evidence that this may have started last August. There's a Harvard research team that did some used remote sensing, and they looked at what was going on in China in August of last year, and they found at the end of August there was a lot of stuff on the internet about certain symptoms. And they're all the symptoms of COVID-19. Why were they on the internet during that time period? Anyway, so.
Andrew.
Yes, we're going to have to end in about 2 minutes. We have one last comment. Would you like to end, Richard, with some observation or final comment?
Andrew, Jean Becker is with us tonight, and she wanted to hear Dr. Haass's favorite memory or story of President George H.W. Bush.
Okay. If Jean Becker asks a question, it has to be answered.
Hey, Jean, great to have you here. Lots of stories. He was very kind when in November of 1990. He didn't know I had just gotten married, and we were flying off to the Middle East together. And Brent told him that it was I had just gotten married, and this was my honeymoon. He looked at me with equal parts shock and horror, and sat down and hand wrote a letter to my new wife, saying that apologizing for taking me away, but promising her that I was really with him in the desert and not doing anything else at the time. One other day I remember, he was very good to me. I had to write a lot of his public statements during the Gulf crisis, and one day I had him go out. I was in a real hurry, and I wrote something, and I had him give these remarks. And the first question, he said, Mr. President, you just said the United States is however many hours into the crisis. That would mean the crisis started like 6 hours before you told us originally it started. Were you hiding something? Were you not being honest with the American people? And he looked at Brent, and then they both looked at me, and I'd simply done math wrong. And I hadn't slept in several days. And very quickly, he basically patted me on the shoulder, basically said, don't worry, no, you haven't had any sleep, and just laughed it off. He said, we're not going to put you in charge of math for the White House, and probably a lot of other stories too, but I'm not sure all of them could be repeated here. But I'll end where I began, which is there's very little about history that's inevitable. And there were so many times I looked around the room with him or Jim Baker or Brent or Bob Gates, and I just realized if it had been a different cast of people, it would have been a really different set of policy outcomes. And these were, I think as a country, we were extraordinarily fortunate to have these people where they were, when they were, in terms of the end of the Cold War, in terms of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and so forth. I just think, and again, so you're all students here at one of the great public policy institutions. I know this is an age of cynicism, but my view is simply, without getting overly idealistic, it just shows possibility. And the good, Andrew asked me before if we could end up in a war, and I said nothing's baked into the cake, nothing's inevitable, and that's true. And the reason that nothing is inevitable, because if and when government does attract really talented people and they work together, they can avoid bad things and accomplish good things. And my own view is that 41, with the passage of time, will really be seen as one of the great foreign policy presidents. Indeed, in the article, in the chapter I wrote with Andrew for your book, I would say only Truman of the post-World War II presidents I would rank higher. I actually think he is one of the great foreign policy presidents in American history.
Thank you, Richard, for being with us, and thank you for writing this book. Everybody should buy it.
Or at least read it.
Yeah, right. Good night.
Thank you all. Stay safe.